Hello everyone, welcome back to the Humankind Industrial Era tier list. This is the fifth part of the series, and we'll be covering every single culture in the Industrial Era, their emblematic quarter, their emblematic unit, their legacy traits, and ultimately where I would rank them on a tier list between the S tier being the top and the D tier being the very bottom. If you're interested in how I've done my rankings and what sort of things I'm considering in actually ranking these different cultures, I go over that in my very first video on the ancient era. I have 10 main factors that I consider, as well as a few other things. So check that out if you're interested in those sort of semantic details. Now, I did plan on doing a contemporary era tier list. I am rethinking that a little bit because at the moment the contemporary era is so completely broken that your culture pick, it just accelerates. It's a matter of how much it accelerates you winning the game rather than actually being important. I'm currently considering doing a different video for the contemporary era instead and revisit the contemporary once some appropriate balance changes have been made. Now, a lot of these balance issues do rear their ugly head in the industrial, even more so than they did in the early modern, and we'll be talking about that. Particularly for the French, it is a major problem, and to a lesser extent for the two builders that are available in the industrial. But let's get right into it with the first culture, which is the Austro-Hungarians. Now, the Austro-Hungarians are an aesthete culture, and the aesthete affinity is pretty bad for the most part, but by this point in the game, it's pretty much not worth it at all. The active ability, I honestly forget it exists because it's so bad. You just like convert some gold into influence and change a territory's sphere of influence a little bit, as long as it's your own territory. It doesn't matter. There are some relation penalties if other people declare war on you, but at this point in the game, you're going to be declaring war on other people to get your militarist and expansionist stars. You'll be the one looking to expand. It's not difficult to do. Anyway, their legacy trait gives +1 influence on district and +1 influence on emblematic district. For an aesthete, this is an okay legacy trait. It does give you a decent bit of influence from the moment that you pick the Austro-Hungarians. It's kind of just like getting a Grand Tea House from the Ming in all of your cities for free, but it's only like getting one. The thing with the Austro-Hungarians is that although they're an aesthete, this is really their primary way of generating influence, and as an aesthete culture, their primary era star being influence, it has inflated requirements, and this doesn't actually give you enough influence to get your aesthete era stars, which are worth the most fame. Sometimes, you can pretty frequently get one. You might be able to get two, but three is not very accomplishable unless you have a lot of other influence from other things. And I would argue that if you are picking the Austro-Hungarians for the influence specifically, you're better off just picking the Ming in the early modern. Or even the Edo really have comparable influence generation capabilities in the previous era, while also having the Naginata Samurai, which is useful in certain situations. So +1 influence, it's okay for the districts and for the emblematic districts. It's not amazing. Influence is not a very important resource, particularly not in the industrial era. Most of what it can do is replaceable by other things, such as pillaging cities and then dropping an outpost to reattach it, or swapping influence to gold in order to attach outposts, that sort of thing. So let's move on to the next part of the Austro-Hungarians, and this is really the reason you pick the Austro-Hungarians, is for the Opern House. Now, the Opern House, it gives a flat +5 influence, which is fine. But really, the core part of this is it gives a little bit of stability for adjacent districts, so that's up to 12 there, but it also provides +1 stability per district in the city. Every single district gets +1 stability. And because it's an emblematic quarter, you can stack this as many times up to the number of territories that you have attached to that city. So in a city with 5 of these, your districts are effectively discounted in their stability by 50%. What this means in theory for the Austro-Hungarians is that you never have to worry about stability again, and you can build these big, huge mega cities with tons of quarters and all that kind of stuff. The unfortunate reality for the Austro-Hungarians is that they are a victim of the game's current design. As the game stands, for the moment, stability is a non-issue in almost every single game you play, unless you manage to trigger pollution effects, which it's pretty easy to avoid, honestly. You don't need most of the polluting infrastructure that you can build. So the Austro-Hungarians' biggest strength is their ability to provide this insane stability on all their cities, but it's just totally redundant. You don't need it at all. You can 100% get away with just your manufactories and some passive effects from technologies that you get in the industrial era and in the contemporary era, like the vaccinations that give, I think, +1 stability per population. And you have tons of manufactories giving you a ton of stability. You probably have some old commons quarters or garrisons from previous eras. You just don't need the stability at all by the time you reach the industrial era. So the Opernhaus it's kind of a wasted district. And it's not that it's a conceptually bad district. In fact, this would be amazing if stability were actually a limiting factor. But because stability isn't a limiting factor, there's really no need to build this thing. So let's talk about the Evidence Bureau agents. And I used to like them more than I do now. Let's talk about what they have going for them. So they are a gunner unit. They have this sly effect, which means they ignore hostile zones of control. So they can, move around adjacent to enemy units just as normal. They also have 52 strength, which is a pretty substantial improvement over something like line infantry. That's +5 over your standard line infantry, or +3 over the AI's line infantry. Now let's talk about some of the major problems with these units. First, they unlock at the technology guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is a technology that doesn't really give you anything that you need to win the game. And in fact, most of the games you play, you are very likely to skip this technology because it's just so unimportant. If you're playing the Austro-Hungarians or the Mexicans, you might pick it up just because it gives you access to your emblematic unit. And the emblematic unit does upgrade to the commandos in the contemporary era. There are some issues with that, namely that by the time you get commandos, the game is over in like 1 to 2 turns from then. But it is one of the better units in the contemporary era if the contemporary were more extended. Now, although it does have this +5 over normal line infantry, perhaps the biggest problem with these units is that it has double the production cost effectively. I think it's actually slightly over double the production cost. So for double the production cost and this out-of-the-way, not very useful technology, you're getting +5 combat strength over regular line infantry. So in terms of production cost, this is comparable to the cuirassiers from the French, who have the capacity to like one-shot a unit. Now, they're not very useful in a siege, and we'll talk more about them later, but that's like the comparable thing to this. An Evidence Bureau agent is more expensive to produce than an APC in the contemporary. It's more expensive to produce than a helicopter in the contemporary, which is just absolute insanity. These things are just outrageously expensive. And is it worth double the production cost for +5 combat strength? In my opinion, not really. There are a lot of other ways to get combat strength other than just like grabbing the highest combat strength unit you can possibly find. And particularly given that you have to take this poor technology that you don't need at all, I am not a big fan of these units at the moment. And even with Sly, where you ignore hostile zones of control, in an era where everything is basically a ranged unit, you're very rarely actually in the zone of control of other units, because there's a gap between you and your opponent. You don't need to be right up against opponents to actually shoot them. You can leave tiles between yourselves. And even if you don't, you can just move through your own units to effectively ignore zone of control anyway. So I think there is a role for these guys, but I think they need to have some adjustments made, particularly on the production cost. Is just way too expensive for what they actually do for you. So where did I put the Austro-Hungarians overall? I think this one's going to be controversial because a lot of people really like the Austro-Hungarians, but I put the Austro-Hungarians in the D tier. And unfortunately, the Austro-Hungarians are a victim of the overall game balance at the moment, and not necessarily that they are a poorly designed culture. The main issue, like I said before, with the Austro-Hungarians is that they rely on stability to be very potent and to be a limiting factor for themselves and for the opponents. But without that, without stability actually limiting anyone, and without the power of the Opernhaus really providing you a benefit relative to other cultures, everything that the Austro-Hungarians provide you is done better by another culture. And the Opernhaus is redundant, but you don't really need it at all. So as a result, I put the Austro-Hungarians in the D tier, which is really too bad. Now, all they really have to do to fix the Austro-Hungarians, in my opinion, there are a few things I'd like to see balanced. I'd like to see influence be a little more valuable. I'd like to see late game civics be a little bit better. But if you just fix stability, the Austro-Hungarians rise to like a B or an A tier if it becomes a significant limiting factor later in the game, and particularly if the Evidence Bureau agents see like a cost reduction or move to another tech, that would help the Austro-Hungarians a lot as well. So Austro-Hungarians, for now, are D tier, but I suspect out of anything I've rated so far, the Austro-Hungarians are the most liable to go up several tiers without actually doing anything that directly affects the balance of the culture itself. So next up we have the British, and the British are expansionists. Expansionist stars are a little bit difficult to earn, but by the industrial era you will have so many armies that it's pretty feasible to 3-star the expansionist affinity. You'll probably be ignoring the active ability, though. It just takes too long to take territory from other people when you could just go to war and pillage their outposts and claim it for yourself. So let's talk about the legacy trait. The legacy trait is plus 10 money and plus 10 science per number of attached territories on capital. This doesn't mean for the number of territories attached to your capital. It means for every territory that you have attached to a city in your entire empire, your capital gets plus 10 money and plus 10 science per attached territory. So what this means for the British is that their legacy trait is a bit of a win more legacy trait. So it's great when you have gone out and conquered a bunch of people already. And honestly, you can probably get like 500 or 600 of both money and science on your capital just by picking up this legacy trait from the moment you get the British. And it's actually a pretty good yield compared to some of the other options that are available in this era. The legacy trait by itself for the British is probably better than the Austro-Hungarians' entire kit for the moment. Just because of the yields it's providing are actually still worthwhile, particularly the science. And because it's concentrated on a single city, it means you can really hyper boost that city with like percent modifiers and all that kind of stuff. So if you have a really big capital in particular that has like a lot of specialist slots, and you have all the infrastructure in there that are providing modifications to the amount of money and science that you're getting, you'll get a pretty good value out of the legacy trait. The legacy trait will give you a decent amount of science and money. It's not production, and it's not like the most amazing money and science you can possibly generate. There are better options, but it's decent, especially for an expansionist culture. So let's talk about the Colonial Office. So the Colonial Office, it's not very good. So the Colonial Office is unique, I will give it that. So it's limited in that you can only build it in a territory of a vassal. If you think about where you're at in the industrial era, consider how often you have a vassal. For me personally, it's not very often because it's better for me to just directly control that territory. Because vassals aren't very useful. Like maybe in an early war, you might vassalize someone, it kind of removes them as a threat for a while, and you get some benefits to that. But later in the game in particular, it's more important for you to just control territory. And even if they are a vassal, let's say you have a vassal or you have two vassals or whatever, it doesn't really provide that much, right? So you get plus 10 money for being the liege, and you get plus 2 money for the liege for adjacent districts, so it's up to plus 22 money. But you have to build it in an opponent's territory, right, in a vassal territory, so they'll also be getting money. And if they break away from you, then you're not getting money anymore. So it's, I mean, conceptually, I think it's fine. I think it's interesting. It's just that vassalage at this point of the game isn't usually worthwhile. Colonial Office doesn't provide enough of the yield that it provides in order to justify building, particularly when you compare to some of the other options that are available in the era. The one good thing about this, is that it doesn't cost any stability. So if for some reason you're struggling with stability, which you really shouldn't be, this gives you an option to build stuff in someone else's territory and continue to increase your yields. But I recommend just fixing your stability issues, to be honest. Colonial Office, yeah, not great. So let's talk about the Redcoats, which are the emblematic unit. And the Redcoats are a replacement for the line infantry. They have the same production cost, which is excellent. They come at the same tech. They are a straight-up buff with plus 4 combat strength over regular line infantry, who have 47, where the Redcoats have 51, or they have plus 2 over a Humankind AI's line infantry. Typical gunner unit, and they also have this trait called Expedition, where they regenerate health when outside of your own territory. So just on the basis of being a plus 4 line infantry alone, the Redcoats are pretty good. There's really no disadvantage to making Redcoats over line infantry. Straight up buff is always appreciated. It's not any more expensive to produce or anything like that. So just having that plus 4 combat strength can be pretty valuable. You'll have an equal-sized army. It doesn't cost any more to upgrade to the Redcoats than to a line infantry, anything like that. Now, Expedition, I find, is a bit of a wasted trait, and this is largely because you're not going to fight a lot of field battles. You pretty much beeline for cities and take them over. And once you take a city, your occupied territory counts as your own for the purposes of regenerating health. So this expedition is only useful if you have to take multiple turns to get to a city between battles, and you have lost health on your units. So it's fine. It comes up every once in a while, but it's not particularly useful just because of the meta of, beelining for cities, which it's kind of like that in every 4X game, let's be honest. So Expedition is a bit wasted, but by virtue of simply being a better line infantry without higher production costs, it actually makes it a fairly decent unit. And line infantry are going to generally comprise the core units of the industrial era, and they're going to be backed up by siege artillery once you unlock those. So, you'll spam these out, you'll have a whole bunch of them in your armies. That plus 4 combat strength that you're getting accumulates across all your different units that you have. It makes a big impact. So really for the British overall, I think this is going to be a little telling about the power level of certain cultures in this era that I really don't like the Colonial Office, but still gave the British a B. So the British, between the legacy trait that they get with the plus 10 money and plus 10 science per attached territory, as well as the Redcoats, I think they make an excellent win more culture, where you're already winning the game and you want to keep on winning. There are some better cultures for that, in my opinion, but it's more a result of the design of builder and scientist cultures rather than something that's innate to the culture themselves. So the British can continue to snowball you. You'll get some nice yields as soon as you pick them. You will notice the difference in money and science output once you pick them if you have a large territory. The Redcoats are a fairly substantial upgrade to the line infantry. Overall, they're a decent culture. You probably won't build the Colonial Office. I would like to perhaps see the Colonial Office buffed a little bit, particularly the whole thing with having to have a vassal. It just makes it too limited in its use. So the French. How do I say this? The French completely break the game, and it has absolutely nothing to do with anything that is unique to the French culture and everything to do with the scientist affinity. Because the scientist affinity allows you to start researching text from the next era, and the chain for nuclear weapons doesn't have any technology prerequisite. So as soon as you select the French, what you can do is start teching the nuclear line, and at the end of that line, you get a passive buff that affects all your cities that gives you plus 50% production everywhere. And what this means with the French is, if they want to use that production, they have a 50% production advantage over everyone else, which is already insane. But because they're scientists, they can convert all that extra production into science and just end the game super quickly. If you have seen like speedruns of the game effectively, where people are finishing in like 70 turns, they're picking the French every single game, as well as the Egyptians. And there's some variation in between those two. But the French are picked every single game. And that's just because of the scientist affinity. Like this legacy trait plus 10% science, yeah, it's nice. You'll get through the tech tree plus 10% faster. But ultimately, the ability to get that 50% production boost that is then converted into science means that you win the game through tech victory way, way faster than any other culture has any chance of doing it. The only exception to this might be if you advanced into the industrial era with another culture. You have already accumulated some stars that have carried over, and you can go up and take like the Swedes or the Japanese in the next era within like a couple turns. So the French, they're basically S tier, even like if they didn't have anything at all other than the scientist affinity, they would still be S tier. So, we'll talk about that a little bit more when it comes to the final rating. Anyway, legacy trait plus 10% science on all cities. Yeah, it's reasonable for a legacy trait. You'll see a 10% boost to all your science right out of the gate. It's fairly comparable to the British, actually, in terms of how much science they'll get from their legacy trait. But obviously, the British get some gold as well. Now, the exhibition hall. This is it's a decent quarter, actually. You get plus 1 science per population, and you can build multiple of these. So, if you have 50 population in a city and you have 4 territories, you can get plus 200 population in that city. And, across your entire empire, you will feel the impact of this. Not only this, though, but you also get some influence as well, plus 3 influence on territory, which seems a little bit odd. I mean, getting an extra, say 12 to 15 influence per exhibition hall can add up. And, you can even be competitive with like the Austro-Hungarians in terms of influence output if you spam the exhibition halls hard enough. Will you probably do that as the French? No, because you're going to activate collective minds in all your cities and win the game in 5 turns. But the exhibition hall, if you are sort of just playing a normal game where you're not really abusing collective minds, actually makes for a fairly reasonable quarter. You'll get a good amount of science output out of it. You get a little bit of bonus influence on top of it. So I really can't fault the exhibition hall at all. It's just that you'll probably not build it because you're going to be converting all your production into science. But once that's fixed, I think there will be people that actually build the exhibition hall. All right, cuirassiers. This is an interesting unit. So it is a cavalry unit in the industrial era, which has some problems. Industrial era cities get extremely big, and most of your battles are going to take place in cities, either offensively most of the time, but occasionally defensively as well, depending on your specific situation and how big your military is, how aggressive your neighbors are, all that kind of stuff. They have 54 base combat strength, a 3 horse and 2 iron requirement, which shouldn't be an issue in the industrial era. Now, they are heavy cavalry, like I mentioned, which means they get a bonus combat strength when they are charging units. Except cuirassiers have this heavier charge trait, which means they give plus 9 when they're charging. So on attack, when they charge, they have a total of 63 combat strength, which is a fair bit over like your base line infantry, which has 47. even accounting for the Humankind difficulty bonus of +2 to units, if you have a couple modifications to your combat strength on the cuirassiers, either through legacy traits or quarters like garrisons, or from adjacency bonuses, or from terrain bonuses, or anything like that, the cuirassiers actually have the capability to one-shot equal era units, including line infantry, because of how much combat strength they can get from heavier charge, particularly when stacked on with some other bonuses that you can accumulate over the course of the game. So the cuirassiers, although they're kind of limited in use because they can't enter into enemy cities, which is the primary thing you're going to be doing in the industrial era, these are extremely, extremely dangerous units when you are defending your own city and can sally out, or when you are in a field battle. Now, there is the disadvantage that they have a very high production cost of a little over 5,000. It's equivalent to the Evidence Bureau agents. The difference for the cuirassiers, and why I like them more than Evidence Bureau agents, is the cuirassiers fill a role that the agents do not. The cuirassiers have the movement and the strength to really get around an enemy line, slam into the back, and very easily take out a unit. The Evidence Bureau agents don't really fill a role that isn't just filled by regular line infantry, except they're just a little bit stronger and a little bit more slippery. Whereas the cuirassiers fill a completely different role. And the cuirassiers there isn't really a unit that has a role like they do in the industrial era. It's not until you get to the contemporary and unlock medium tanks and modern armor that you get something that fills that kind of role as a flanking cavalry kind of unit. So the cuirassiers fill this sort of gap in the tech tree, and they're very good at doing it. The thing that holds them back is that that particular role isn't as important in the industrial era as it was in other eras, thanks to the inability of these units to cross walls. Now, thanks to the presence of siege artillery, there will be occasions where you can knock walls down and get these inside a city, so it does redeem it a little bit, but it is still limited in that regard. I'd rate it, considering the production cost and its ability and where it fits in the tech tree and all that kind of stuff, I'd say it's an average unit, but in the situations where it really, in the situations where it's bad, it's pretty much useless, and in the situations where it's good, it's really, really powerful. So, French overall, I know in the last video, I kind of hedged my bets a little bit, right, and said, like, oh, well, this culture is really, really good because of the affinity and all the other bonuses it gets are average. I couldn't bring myself to do that with the French because the scientist affinity in the industrial era so completely breaks the game on a level that no other culture can match, except for maybe like an ascended Joseon coming from the early modern. Just because of the ability to start researching the contemporary era technologies. You could strip away everything about the French, it wouldn't even matter, they'd still be the most powerful culture in the era. And it's a major balance issue. Everyone knows it at this point. Collective minds, researching into the nuclear technologies, getting a massive production boost that's converted into science, blah, blah, blah. Even not accounting for that, I would still say most of what the French gets is above average for the era. And I think even with a complete rework of the scientist culture, or scientist affinity, they would still be a pretty decent culture. They have the capacity to generate a fair amount of science. And the cuirassiers, they fill a niche that isn't really filled by other cultures. So French, yeah, they're S tier. Like, they're really like S++ tier. There isn't any other culture in the game that can touch how broken the French are for when the French enter the game. So let's move on to the Germans. And the Germans are a militarist. And the militarist affinity, there are some interesting things you can do with it in the previous eras because you get extra war support. And that remains relevant for a lot of the game. Where it becomes interesting in the industrial era is iron reserves will start to give you ranged gunner units, and they'll benefit from dug in as well. So you can use iron reserves to quickly build up like this really big force of kind of cheap crap units, but because they're all ranged gunners, you can make way better use of them than you could previous sort of garrison units. Anyway, they do get the legacy trait, +3 combat strength on naval unit, as well as +3 combat strength on air unit, and minus 20% unit industry cost. This seems a little bit better on its surface than it is. Naval units are not very relevant. I've mentioned this in the past. You can completely play a game of Humankind without ever building a single naval unit the entire game. So naval units, I mean, anything affecting them is a bit of a waste most of the time. Perhaps more relevant in multiplayer if people are actually defending their seas, but in single player, it's really easy to just give the AI the slip and land on their continent and start taking their cities. I think the +3 combat strength on air units has more potential to be good. There are a couple problems with it, though. First is that in the industrial era, biplanes are really not impactful at all. They don't do enough damage. They don't have enough range. They're really not worth building. It's not until the contemporary era that you'd really start feeling the effects of this, but air combat suffers from a lot of problems that's going to hinder you. The first is that, particularly when you're playing on larger maps, oftentimes the range of air units isn't enough to keep up with your armies. You know, you'd have to keep building aerodromes in more and more forward positions, and the AI don't always do that, where, you know, if you take over cities, you can keep moving your fighters up. I used to think, like, having 20 range or whatever was pretty good, but once I've seen it in practice, I found that most of the time, my air units aren't able to reach the battlefields that I want them to be able to reach. Now, it is effective at, like, the start of a war, for instance, right, where you are able to prepare, but as soon as you like break past the front line, it's like your air units might as well not exist. The other issue is that when you're, say you have an aerodrome and it ends up within the battlefield, those air units basically do not exist. If the place where your air units are stationed ends up within the battlefield, you can't use those air units, which is a major, major problem because battlefields in the industrial era get really, really big. And any battlefield that touches any tile that is connected to a city will engulf the entire city. So never build an aerodrome connected to the city because it's very likely you'll get shut out of using your air units. So I think the +3 combat strength on air unit has more potential to be good. It's harder to make naval units relevant. This has always been a problem in 4X games. I think air units actually need longer range in order to be effective most of the time. They also tend to take a lot of damage when they're attacking. If there's literally any anti-air or anything intercepting, there needs to be some kind of escort mission for fighters or something to make them a little bit better. But anyway, those are my thoughts on air units. Really, the most effective part of this legacy trait ends up being the unit industry cost reduction. And, you know, this can be stacked up to some extent with previous industry cost reductions. You know, each subsequent reduction is not worth as much as previous ones, right? If you have 5 minus 20% industry costs, that's not negative, or it's not minus 100% industry cost. You don't get free units. That's not how it works. So, you know, if you have like minus 60% unit industry cost already, you're not going to get a lot of value out of this. But if you haven't had any industry cost reductions previously, getting a 20% unit industry cost reduction on units that do become relatively expensive, you know, when you're talking about 2,500, 3,000 industry cost, can save you quite a bit of time and allow you to build your armies faster and more efficiently. So the Coking Works is the emblematic quarter, and this one's an interesting one. I would say the Coking Works is actually the best industry building in the industrial era. It provides you +1 industry per population, flat out, and +3 industry per adjacent maker's quarter. It counts as a maker's quarter, all that. The thing that holds the Coking Works back a bit is that it does give +10 pollution. So if you stack up a bunch of these in your cities, you're going to start polluting very quickly. So the coking works, you can get a lot of production out of it. I mean, you can get like 70, 80, 90 production depending on the size of your cities. It's really a pretty good district in terms of giving you industry. Even with the builder cultures, the builders don't provide as much industry as the coking works does with their emblematic quarters, though they have other advantages we'll talk about later. The thing holding it back is really the pollution, though. If you stack it up too much, you will feel the impact from that. Pollution effects tend to set in quite early. So coking works is something you might limit yourself a little bit on. You won't build it in every single territory that you own just because of the pollution effects, unless you have like really high science output and you're able to push for some of the contemporary techs very quickly by taking an early era up. So coking works, great industry, little limited by pollution. So let's talk about the emblematic unit, which is the U-boat. The U-boat is unfortunately a bit of a wasted unit. I mean, stealth, it's totally wasted when it comes to naval units in single player. When you're on land, you can get a little bit of use out of stealth because of how terrain works. You can kind of block off access to your stealth units, and it allows your stealth units to shoot down at people without being retaliated against. On the open ocean, there is nothing stopping the AI from using its unlimited vision of everything you own, from just rolling up next to your U-boat or other stealth unit and just blowing it up. So yes, you can enter another empire's borders with it, but that's about the extent of usefulness of stealth for the U-boats, because the AI knows exactly where you are, and they're going to come blow up your U-boat every single time. But not only that, naval units just don't matter. Again, I want them to matter. I really do. I like naval combat in 4X games, but there's just not enough incentive to actually control the seas. The primary objective of everyone is, take the cities, and U-boats don't provide you any benefit to doing that. They just destroy ships, really. And you can do a little bit of scouting, but you don't really need the U-boat for that anyway. So U-boat, yeah, pretty below average unit. Even if sea warfare were to be fixed, you would probably just use other units because the stealth is pretty much wasted against the AI. Maybe against players it's a little bit better, but in single player, I don't blame you if you never build the U-boat at all. So where do I put the Germans? I actually put the Germans in the B tier. Despite the U-boat not being very useful, really in the industrial era, you can get away with just using generic units. Line infantry and siege artillery are all you need. Anything on top of that is just a bonus. And the Germans get a fairly decent discount to actually producing those units. Now, the +3 combat strength on air and naval units is mostly wasted. You might get a little bit of use out of the extra combat strength on air units in the contemporary era, but contemporary does not last very long. The main reason the Germans are in the B tier, though, is primarily the coking works. If you are really trying to get a lot of production going for whatever reason, maybe you don't have a lot from previous cultures or whatever, the Germans make a decent choice, actually, for ramping up your production a lot if you have fallen behind. Is it as good as taking a builder culture, like the Siamese or the Persians? Probably not. It might be a little bit dependent on your situation. Obviously, the Germans don't have access to land raisers, so they can't convert all their other yields into production. But they do provide just a bunch of flat production on the coking works, also providing that unit industry discount in an era where you are going to be producing a lot of units. And really maintain pretty sizable but expensive armies where that unit industry cost reduction is going to be felt a lot. So the Germans, I'm putting them right in the middle of the pack at B tier. So let's talk about the Italians. Italians are another aesthetes and kind of suffer a lot of the same problems that the Austro-Hungarians do, with one exception. But first, let's talk about the legacy trait. The legacy trait gives +10 stability on commons quarters, +1 influence on commons quarters, and it modifies the industry cost of commons quarters by negative 50%. So you get a 50% discount when you're building these things, or you build them twice as fast. This can also be stacked up with a civic that gives you an industry cost reduction on commons quarters, I believe also by 50%. So really you can be building commons quarters, you can build 4 of them that for the cost of 1, effectively, if you have that civic as well as this legacy trait. And then it gives the commons quarters this +10 stability in addition to adjacency stability that they get and a little bit of extra influence. It's really quite potent. And I've talked about this in the beta. Where the Italians are good is where you plan to be conquering a lot of cities, and the Austro-Hungarians where you have a bunch of cities already under your control that you want to really ramp up. So the Austro-Hungarians, right, once you advance into the contemporary, you don't have access to the Opera House anymore. So you build the Opera House in all the cities that you own, and you can continue building those up in the future eras. The Italians, with their stability that they get on the commons quarters, it does affect the cities they already own, but cities that they take over can slap down some commons quarters and continue to benefit from this legacy trait in order to provide them with stability. The issue, just like the Austro-Hungarians, though, is that stability just does not matter at the moment. It is super, super easy to maintain high stability through the use of manufactories, through technologies, all that kind of stuff. There's pretty much never a point in the industrial or contemporary era where you should be struggling with stability unless you've accidentally triggered pollution mechanics, which, again, are fairly easy to avoid. So in theory, I like this trait. It makes commons quarters very affordable. It makes them worth building. You can get a lot of stability out of them, and it helps particularly if you want to go conquer other players later in the game compared to the Austro-Hungarians. But again, stability, yeah, not at this point. It's just not really worth having over anything else. So let's talk about the teatro, or what I'll call the theater. This is an influence-providing district, and it gives you a little bit of base influence, some influence for adjacent commons quarters, which is nice considering the discount the Italians get, a little bit of stability. The main reason for this building is the +1 influence per trader and +1 influence per researcher. So if you have cities that are working a lot of these slots, you can get a fairly sizable amount of influence out of the theater, particularly if you stack up multiple of them in the same city. This actually makes the Italians a fair bit better than the Austro-Hungarians at generating influence, in my opinion. You will have cities that are very specialized with traders and researchers. You'll slam down some theaters in those cities and produce a bunch of influence, on top of a little bit of influence benefit to your commons quarters that you can also build very quickly. So the Italians end up being better at generating influence than the Austro-Hungarians in a lot of situations. Not every single time, but a lot of the time. And that makes them a little bit better. It's just that influence, again, just doesn't really matter that much. But, if you really do want influence, most of the time the Italians end up being a little bit better at generating it. So let's move on to the Alpini, which is really the redeeming factor for the Italians in the current state of the game. The Alpini is probably my favorite unit in the game in terms of its effect on combat. So it is a line infantry replacement, basically, and it has 50 combat strength, so it's only 1 less than the Redcoat. Same production cost, only 3 population, it has 5 movement, but really critically, the most important thing about the Alpini is that it has Cliff's Crosser. And what this allows the Alpini to do is move over cliffs as if they're normal tiles. And if you've played the game enough, you have come to realize that one of the biggest impediments to your combat ability is your ability to move around the terrain and get the shots that you need to take. The Alpini basically totally trivializes the need to smartly position your units, because you're able to just put them basically wherever you want. There's almost nothing in the game that's going to impede your ability to actually move the Alpini around. And what that means is you can take advantage of a much larger area of the battlefield than you otherwise could using other units. What this means as well is that you have much more units bringing to bear their firepower on enemy units. So by virtue of being able to get up onto cliffs and get to areas other units can't, they can bring more firepower to bear, they can get combat strength bonuses from being on high ground, and so on and so forth. Alpini are amazing units. They're really, really good. I would probably consider them the best unit in the industrial era just because of their ability to cross cliffs, as well as just a flat +3 combat strength bonus over regular line infantry. So Alpini, amazing. So where did I put the Italians? I put them in C above the Austro-Hungarians. I don't think I could justify putting them in D given the strength of the Alpini and given the fact that they are better at generating influence in most situations than the Austro-Hungarians. I mean, you could probably make an argument for D if you really wanted to, given the current state of the game and how stability is. But again, the Italians here are a victim of the overall game balance and not necessarily being a culture that is designed poorly. And we will see an example of that culture later in the video. The Italians would benefit a lot if, just if influence were more valuable and if stability were harder to maintain in your cities. For now, though, I've put the Italians in C, largely because of their emblematic unit. So next you have the Mexicans, and the Mexicans are an agrarian culture. Agrarians have kind of become outdated at this point. It's not too hard to grow your cities by the time the industrial era rolls around. Like, yeah, you can steal pops, but, you're always gaining a pop every turn. Your other players will recover their pops pretty easily, and you can only support so many pops realistically given your food income. So agrarian affinity, it's fine, but it's really better earlier in the game. Let's talk about the legacy trait, though, which is plus 10% food on all cities. On its face, it seems fine. In reality, plus 10% food doesn't translate to plus 10% more population because of the cost scaling of food. So really, plus 10% food, depending on how big your cities are, it's going to be more like plus 7% population. So say you have this legacy trait plus 10% food, and you have a city with a population of 40, you'll get like 3 extra pops from this legacy trait per city, which translates to, I don't know, maybe like 25 extra output or something like that. Depending on how many buffs you have going on your various slots. There are much better legacy traits available to you. I'd much rather have like the British legacy trait or the French one that are going to provide much higher value of output than plus 10% food. Like, you really shouldn't be struggling to maintain your food income in the industrial era, and there is a point at which it just becomes redundant. You don't need more pops, and that particularly rears its head in the industrial era. So, plus 10% food, yeah, in theory it's fine. I think it needs to be more, though, to really make this a competitive legacy trait. Now, it does function in conjunction with the Hacienda, right? And the Hacienda is actually a pretty reasonably good food generator because it gives +1 food on tile producing food. So effectively, you're able to take like the Haudenosauneen's legacy trait and replicate it, except it's even better because it's on tile rather than on exploitation. So for every hacienda that you have, every single agriculture quarter that you have, every other quarter that has a food yield like the Bere, and every single exploitation where you're working food is going to get +1 food on that tile. So the hacienda is actually pretty good at making food. And as a result of that, and as a result of being able to stack up a whole bunch of these in a single city, you can have a ton of food income. Now, food, not as valuable at this point in the game. The Mexicans are able to overcome certain limitations on food and scaling because of how good the hacienda can be if you have a larger city. But they are still going to reach the point where it becomes infeasible to continue to grow because of how expensive it is to maintain your existing population. Where I think the Mexicans shine between their legacy traits and the hacienda are in situations where you have cultures that perhaps haven't had the opportunity to grow very much and you really need to fill in specialist slots. I think they run into an issue though, where at that point the industrial era comes around. It's more efficient to just keep going all in on quarters, and the specialists aren't like having an additional specialist is not nearly as good as having another quarter, for instance. Like a maker's quarter is way more efficient than a worker. A market quarter is usually more efficient than a trader. And a research quarter is definitely more efficient than a researcher, barring very specific circumstances. So as a result, what you end up wanting is just something that allows you to build more districts rather than something that allows you to maintain a higher population. So the hacienda, yeah, it gives you great food, but at this point in the game, food is not nearly as valuable of an output because of how quarters have overtaken the value of specialists. So soldaderas, these are an interesting one. I don't know how to feel about them still. They unlock at guerrilla warfare, same as the evidence bureau agents. So it's a bit of an awkward tech. In most games, you're going to skip it, including myself. It doesn't really give you much of value. Now, they aren't any more expensive than a line infantry. They have 49 combat strength, which is +2 over a baseline infantry, or equivalent to an AI's line infantry. So, that's an advantage still. They do have stealth, and they remain hidden even when attacking. So that means when you attack, they don't reveal themselves, unlike some previous stealth units. And, of course, you can enter into another empire's territory as long as your units have stealth. They also aren't any more expensive to produce. I don't remember if I mentioned that already. It's the same cost as line infantry. Again, stealth is wasted on units because the AI know where all your stuff is anyway. So it doesn't matter that you reveal yourself, if you reveal yourself when you're firing or not, because all that matters is whether or not the AI can get adjacent to you in order to retaliate. So the fact that they remain hidden even when attacking is completely wasted in single player. It does not matter at all. So it's no better than just having any old regular stealth unit. The only real advantage to this is +2 combat strength over line infantry. It does upgrade to the commando in the next era, but the commando comes so late in the game that the game's basically over at that point, even if they are one of the better units. So the soldaderas, I mean, is it like, yeah, you can build them. They're a little bit better than just having a standard line infantry, but I'd rather have some of the other units of the era, like the Alpini or the Redcoats or even the Cuirassier, because the soldaderas, you can easily replace their role with just regular old line infantry. So Mexicans overall, I put them in the C tier, and the soldaderas, I've already, I just talked about them, but food, it's just not good enough in the industrial era. You need to really provide a ton of food to actually be worth it over something like industry or science, and to a lesser extent money. And particularly because population growth is limited to 1 per turn, having a ton of excess food just doesn't really make that big of a difference. Like, you just need positive food to keep growing. Anything beyond like that +1 population per turn is just wasted. So the Mexicans, really constrained by where they come in at this point of the game, because you're already going to have decently large cities. You're going to have decently high food upkeep. They're not like totally useless like the Austro-Hungarians are, at least for the moment. In the future, I hope that'll change. But the Mexicans, they're again a bit of a victim of how the late game actually plays out. So let's talk about the Persians. The Persians are a builder culture, and I've talked in the previous video about builder cultures already, how they slap on Landraiser, produce a ton of units, produce a ton of quarters, whatever it is they need. It's totally broken. So let's move on to the legacy trait. The legacy trait on the Persians is amazing. So the legacy trait reduces the shared project industry cost by 25%. So this includes things like wonders, and it also includes national projects, which includes the nuclear stuff, like the ICBM test and the nuclear test and all that, as well as space race projects. So all of that is just flat out reduced by 25%, and those can be fairly expensive things to produce, and you can stack this up with things like the Topkapi Palace, which gives you 100% increased industry towards those shared projects, and you can produce them very quickly. Additionally, though, the legacy trait reduces all constructible industry cost by minus 25%. What's a constructible? A constructible is literally everything that your city builds. It includes units, it includes quarters, it includes the repeatables that I forget the name of, like the festivals and parades and all that kind of nonsense. So everything that you build in your cities has a reduced industry cost of minus 25%, which is insane. You build everything 25, well, technically it's faster than that, but you produce everything faster than everyone else does by a fairly considerable margin. And what this means is that the Persians can start snowballing things even faster than other people, right? So say the 25% reduction, allows you to produce an extra district every turn compared to someone else, or one extra district every 4 turns, whatever it is. That extra production and extra science you're getting really adds up over the course of, the 50 turns or whatever it takes to get to the end of the game. Yeah, this is a really good trait, and, it applies to units as well, and particularly once you slap on Land Razor, this gets, it gets pretty nutty. So let's move on to the Caravanserai, which is the emblematic quarter. This is an interesting one. It's a bit gold focused for builder culture. It gives +1 money per trade route. It gives a little bit of base money and some base industry, some extra money for adjacent market quarters. It does act as both a market and a maker's quarter, which is pretty nice. Additionally, you can actually place it anywhere. It doesn't have to be adjacent to another district. So you can place it in the ideal spot for industry. Now, in the industrial era, you kind of want to be adjacent because there are a lot of adjacency bonuses that you get, but you can get a pretty considerable amount of production by putting this down in an area where you're not able to normally build districts. Additionally, it also applies Swift to friendly armies that are on the district, which is +3 movement. So effectively, the Persians are able to get like a bit of a discount railway through this while also getting money in industry and not producing any pollution. So at this point of the game, this extra movement can actually be fairly helpful, particularly if you have a very large empire and you want to move units across it, but you don't really want to invest in rail stations, particularly given that they pollute. Which can be a major limiting factor later in the game if you accidentally trigger those local pollution thresholds. So the Caravanserai, yeah, it's a decent quarter. I mean, a little bit of money per trade route, that's fine. You're likely to be at war with pretty much everyone in the industrial era, but you can generate a little bit of extra money through this, particularly if you stack up a whole bunch in one city. +5 money per trade route or whatever. It's pretty nice. Particularly if you've taken someone like the Ghanaians for the luxuries market in the earlier eras, you can get a lot of money from trade routes by picking the Persians, in addition to some industry benefits, which of course are always great. So let's talk about the emblematic unit, which I'm still not sure how to pronounce. Jazerkais, whatever it is. Maybe someone can let me know how to actually pronounce it. This one's an interesting unit. So on its face, it looks like a line infantry replacement, but it actually isn't. It comes in an earlier technology, military coordination, which is the tech before line infantry. It does have 1 less combat strength than your normal line infantry. It does have an equal production cost. The key here, though, is that when this unit is attacking, you have +5 combat strength. I'm a bit torn on this unit. Would I rather have this over regular line infantry? Yes, most of the time, because -1 combat strength on defense is probably worth the trade-off of +5 combat strength when attacking. There's a major issue with it, though, which is that you have to hard build these units. You can't upgrade previous units into them, unlike other units like the Alpini and the Redcoats, where you can upgrade previous units into those units. So you have to hard build the Persians' emblematic unit. Now, it shouldn't be an issue for you, particularly if you slap on Landraiser, but it means that you can't really take advantage of your unit as effectively as some of the other cultures are able to. Now, when you do have them, they're fairly effective units. Having 51 combat strength when attacking is pretty nice for what's effectively a frontline combat unit. You will have a combat strength advantage over your foes. You do take a little bit more damage in return, though. Overall, it has some drawbacks. It has some advantages. I'd rate it a fairly average unit. So where do I put the Persians overall? I put them in A tier. And a lot of this has to do with the builder affinity, as well as the legacy trait is very good. The caravanserai is average to maybe slightly above average, and the emblematic unit is fairly average. But the discount on production costs, particularly when combined with Landraiser, gets really, really crazy. You can pump out tons of units, tons of districts, whatever it is that you need, and eventually get up into the next era. Does it break the game as much as the French do? No, and it's not even close, which is why I put the Persians in the A tier rather than the S tier. But the reduction on industry cost for everything that you're building, excellent. And everything else is good enough that it's not a drag on the culture, and I think it's enough for A tier when combined with the builder affinity. So next we have the Russians. The Russians are expansionists. And let me say straight out the gate, if you want to play an expansionist and you're looking at the Russians, just pick the British. So let's talk about the legacy trait. The legacy trait gives plus 10 experience on creating a unit per number of attached territories in all cities, and plus 10 war support increase when capturing a city on relations. This legacy trait gives you absolutely nothing that you need in this era. By the time you reach the industrial era, you are going to be running around with a ton of max veterancy units. You're going to be able to create units that already have fairly high veterancy thanks to infrastructure, thanks to legacy traits, thanks to districts that you already own that are going to provide experience. And war support at the point of the industrial era is basically a non-issue thanks to certain civics as well as various legacy traits as well as religious tenets. You can basically maintain infinite war support for an entire war if you need to without having this legacy trait. As a result, this legacy trait basically does absolutely nothing for you. Yes, having some extra experience on a unit without having to invest anything in it is fine. I mean, you can get 2 veterancy, maybe 3 veterancy off of this, depending on how many territories you have. Which, gives you plus 2 or plus 3 combat strength on your units, on all the units that you build, assuming you maintain all those territories. It's just so easy to get that experience in other ways, and you're already going to have a ton of max vet armies from previous eras. So I really don't like this legacy trait. I think it's totally wasted. There are way better traits that are available on being able to produce more units through the Persians or the Germans, way better than getting this experience, particularly given how expensive some of the units can get and how easy it is to get access to higher veterancy units by the time the industrial era rolls around. So next we have the Sobor. And the Sobor is an absolutely trash emblematic quarter. Gives plus 3 influence, plus 5 faith per adjacent district, plus 5 stability, and plus 10 health regeneration on unit. So plus 3 influence is not enough to really do anything. Plus 5 faith per adjacent district. Doesn't matter. Faith is completely useless at this point in the game unless you have the Angkor Wat. But even then, food has declined so much in value by this point. The Angkor Wat, it's helping your culture and your cities, but getting an extra 20 faith, translating to 20 food, who cares? And 30, even if it's 30 food, wow, it's distributed to all your cities. You get 1 more pop in all your cities. Congratulations. And then plus 10 health regeneration on unit. I think this is where the devs thought a lot of power would rest in the Sobor. allowing your units to basically instantly recover all their health after a battle. And it makes the Sobor kind of this defensive quarter. The problem with this, particularly in single player, I don't know how much this applies to multiplayer, but in single player, if you're fighting a defensive battle, basically after that you just win, right? You win the battle and then you just roll into enemy territory and clean up. You don't really need to stick around and regenerate health anyway, because you are so superior to the AI in terms of how many units you have and the tech level of your units, and the ability of you to control your units such that you don't lose your low health ones. This health regeneration, it's just completely wasted. It's very rare you're actually going to fight a significant battle in your own territory where you lose a ton of health on your units. And as a result, the Sobor is just really, really bad. It's just too limited in use. Even if you do build it, it's only going to be in cities that are like on the front line, and it doesn't actually provide you with any yields that you need. It doesn't provide you with like combat strength or something like garrisons do. I'd rather have an emblematic garrison where I can get some combat strength defensively than have the Sobor, because at least the garrisons will help me win the battle. The Sobor just helps me recover a little bit faster after the battle's over. Now let's talk about the Cossack. The Cossack is unfortunately another terrible unit. It's about 2,500 production cost, which I believe is the same as the Dragoon, which it replaces. The unfortunate thing about the Cossack is that it actually has lower combat strength than the Dragoon. Now, if you account for the Russians' experience, assuming that you wouldn't have any experience on your units otherwise, and that through the Russian legacy trait you get 3-star experience on your units, the Cossacks have 1 more combat strength than a completely unvetted Dragoon. As soon as a Dragoon gets 1 veterancy, which is super easy to do, a Cossack is the equivalent of a Dragoon, and once the Dragoon gets beyond that, the Dragoon is just straight up better. The Cossack has this multi-move, so it can move until all its movement points are depleted and ignore Zone of Control. Zone of Control doesn't matter that much at this point because everything's ranged combat. The Dragoon, though, has fire and move, so it can move, it can shoot, and then it can move again. So effectively it ends up filling the same role, but the Dragoon also has higher combat strength without the Cossack really having any advantage over it. And because the Cossack replaces the Dragoon, you don't have the option to build the Dragoon as the Russians, which I would prefer because it has higher combat strength. So the Cossack ends up just being worse than the unit it replaces because of the lower CS. And as a result, I've put the Russians in the D tier, which is very unfortunate. And unlike things like the Austro-Hungarians, Italians, and Mexicans, where I think they're victim of game balance, I think the Russians are just a really poorly designed culture at the moment. Everything they give is just like so easy to get in other ways that it is totally redundant. And the Cossack just being worse than Dragoon, I mean, man, I really can't emphasize enough how bad the Russians are, which is really unfortunate. I'd really like to see a complete redesign of the Russians. I think they should be way, way better than they are. And the Sobor in particular should really be a target here, I think. Maybe if there's some changes to religion again, it might be a little bit better. Faith cultures have declined in value a lot. There used to be a lot of value in producing extra faith because you could get more outputs per number of followers or more outputs per co-religion estate and that kind of stuff, but none of that's in the game anymore, so it just doesn't matter. So Russians, yeah, they're D tier. If I had to pick between the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians, I would pick the Austro-Hungarians. I do think, though, at the moment they're both down in D tier. Next are the Siamese, who are a builder culture, and much like the Persians, they have a lot of overlap with a merchant culture, which is interesting because there aren't any merchant cultures in the industrial era. But the Siamese provide this great legacy trait of +3 industry per district on all cities, and they also just get a +1 money generated from ongoing trade on all cities. What this means is from the moment you pick the Siamese, you get a fairly sizable industry boost on all your cities. If you have 50 districts in a city, you get 150 industry in that city. And you continue to get a little bit of extra industry for every extra district that you produce. The extra money generated from ongoing trade, it's nice. I consider this a bit of a side benefit, though. Really, the main function of this legacy trait is to increase your industry output. Now, the one thing that is good about generating this extra money, and this goes for the Persians as well, is that when you turn on your land raiser, that money gets converted into industry at a 1-to-1 ratio. So this money that you're getting from this legacy trait can effectively be converted into production if you need it to be, or if you take the Japanese or the Swedes to the next era, it can be converted into science. So legacy trait, +3 industry per district on all cities. Excellent legacy trait, provides you a pretty sizable amount of production across all your cities, and is one of the most important outputs in the game. The floating market is the emblematic quarter. There were some issues with this in previous eras. I'll talk about that in a second, but first, it provides +1 money per population. So the Siamese, by having a floating market, they get the equivalent of the Dutch legacy traits, basically, by having a single floating market, except you can have multiple of these in one city. So the Siamese, because of the floating market, can actually be a very competent gold-generating culture. And again, that gold can be converted into production. So this floating market, you have to put it on a coastal water or lake tile. And it used to be that the floating market needed to be placed adjacent to an existing district that was attached to your city center, which really limited its placement. But that's since been fixed, so you can place the floating market freely like a harbor now. So the only limitation to your ability to place the floating market is the number of territories in your empire that have access to water tiles. Now, at this point in the game, that shouldn't be a major issue. You will, of course, have territories where there aren't any water tiles. But even if it's just like a single tile that's a lake, the floating market doesn't rely on adjacency from other lakes to generate its outputs. It just relies on having a large population. So you don't need to have a lot of water. As long as there's like one piece of water in most of your territories, you'll be able to make good use of the floating market. Yeah, the floating market is a great quarter, honestly. One of the main issues with money is that you often can't generate enough money to actually make it worth it. But the Siamese, since the floating market, it provides a little bit of industry, you get a little bit of extra from your legacy trait, but your ability to produce multiple of these in the same city means you could get a lot of money on each city, and it's enough to actually make a difference and allow you to start buying things out. If you have 9 cities or whatever, and they're all generating an extra, say, 200 money from the floating market on average, an extra 1,800 gold is enough to buy stuff out every couple turns. And it effectively allows you to move production from one city to another. That's really what money allows you to do. So when you go in and you conquer another city off another player, or say you set up a new city in the new world or whatever, it allows you to quickly get those cities online and actually become productive members of your empire. So the floating market provides a ton of money. The Siamese provide enough industry, and they also have access to the land raiser from the builder affinity to convert that money into production. Very good, well-rounded civ. They provide a lot of outputs overall, and they also have the Gatling elephant. And the Gatling elephant's interesting. It replaces the machine gun. It has a very high production cost, a little over 5,000, about 5,150. And has a higher combat strength than the machine gun, of course, as well as some extra movements, 6 movements. What's interesting about the Gatling elephants, it has a lot of the same effects as the machine gun does. It has this gunner trait, and it has suppression. So typically gunner seems to get dug in. What I've noticed when actually playing the game is that the Gatling elephant doesn't actually dig in, and I'm not sure if that's intended or not. So typically when you get dug in, you get +10 combat strength against units that are like attacking you at a range, unless you've been hit by artillery. So the Gatling elephants, by not having the dug-in status, and again, I'm not sure if this is intended behavior or not, it makes it less effective on offense or on defense, but more effective on offense because of its ability to move and fire and higher base combat strength. So the Gatling elephant is great to move into position and being able to open fire on that same turn, which the machine gun cannot do, but it's more liable to being focused fire by enemy units. It also has a higher production cost, but the Siamese, being builders and getting some benefits to their production, are typically able to handle that, as well as support the fairly high upkeep of the Gatling elephant of 60 gold. So Gatling elephants, it's an interesting unit, honestly. I like the idea that it's kind of a trade-off with the regular machine gun. You won't have access to the regular machine gun if you take the Gatling elephant, so you're kind of dipping into going for a more offensive style of unit compared to the machine gun, which is more defensive with the dug-in. Now, if that's not intended behavior with the Gatling elephants, not getting dug in, obviously the Gatling elephant rises in stock. I'd say the Gatling elephant, though, because of that trade-off, makes it a fairly average unit, though keep in mind that in most games that you're playing in single player in the industrial era, you are going to be on the offense. Gatling elephants are worth building a few of, even if only just for their suppression effect and fairly high combat strength. So Siamese, overall, I placed them in A tier alongside the Persians. They don't get the same level of production bonuses as the Persians do, because the Persians get that massive discount on all the stuff that they build. But the Siamese make up for it by still providing production, but also providing a very sizable amount of gold that can be converted into production or used to simply buy things out or support larger armies or whatever, while also having the Gatling elephant that you can make pretty good use of. Like the Persians, though, one of the main things driving this high ranking is the builder affinity, where you can turn on Landraiser and just build tons of units. But again, it doesn't break the game as much as the French do. So next and last are the Zulu. And the Zulu get the legacy trait, plus 50% health regeneration on a unit, and plus 2 combat strength for units starting their turn in allied territory. Now, this plus 50% health regeneration on on units, yeah, it's okay. It allows you to recover faster after fights. In fact, I rate this better than the Sobor. And that's because this is going to apply when, after you've taken an enemy city, and that city effectively becomes yours and you start to regenerate, you're regenerating more. And that's going to be the primary time where you're actually taking damage. So you're going to regenerate faster after you've successfully sieged an enemy city. Whereas the Russians, with the Sobor, you have to be in your own territory, right? So this plus 50% health regeneration on unit, better than the Sobor, basically. So this tacked on legacy trait is better than the Russians' entire emblematic quarter. The legacy trait, though, also provides plus 2 combat strength on units starting their turn in an allied territory. So really, the Zulu are very good at being this defensive culture. If you are getting attacked a lot and hanging out in your own territory, the enemy sieging you down, you can basically get a permanent plus 2 combat strength on all your units. It's also somewhat effective on attack if you can get to an enemy city from your own territory in one turn. You'll be able to get that plus 2 combat strength on your units in order to attack that city. It's an okay legacy trait. I don't rate it as highly as the Spanish because if you are still losing in the industrial era, you kind of have a problem. You're not playing as well as you should be. So the Zulu present a bit of an opportunity to try to catch up militarily. But if you're struggling at this point militarily, something has really gone wrong in an earlier part of your game. But let's talk about the Warriors Zindlu, which is the emblematic quarter. Now, this thing is basically a garrison, and it provides a pretty sizable plus 4 combat strength for units that are adjacent to the district or units that are in the district, a little bit of stability, and additionally it provides a little bit of extra experience when you are creating units. So again, this really plays into the Zulu being this very defensive culture. You have some extra combat strength on your units just by starting in your own territory. You have a few of these down in strategic locations to help defend yourself, giving your combat strength boosts to a whole bunch of units, as well as helping a little bit on the experience front, which it's a bit tacked on, but it can be useful. So again, if you have a situation where you're really under assault and you really desperately need combat strength in order to survive, you can pick the Zulu. Ultimately, though, I think, and we'll get into the emblematic unit in a second, I think if you're really this desperate, you're really just better off taking a culture that has a stronger emblematic unit. Because even if you're winning your defensive battles, it doesn't provide you any benefits to counterattacking and actually getting the game back under control. Like, yes, you can hold your own territory, but you can't go take territory off the enemy that is apparently ahead of you if they're constantly sieging your cities. So perhaps there are more uses for this in multiplayer, but in single player, between this and the legacy trait, there isn't a lot of use for the Zulu. The Impy is interesting. So as soon as you pick the Zulu, you can build the Impy in the industrial era. It's like half the production cost of a line infantry. It has 45 base combat strength, which is only 2 less than a regular line infantry. But it is a melee unit, but it does get +4 combat strength when it's attacking stronger units. Main issue with Impy is that when you use them against the AI and Humankind difficulty, Unstoppable only makes them equivalent to AI line infantry. They're each going to have 49 combat strength. So the Impy attacks, say the Impy goes and attacks a line infantry. The line infantry takes damage, and the Impy takes damage in retaliation. Next, on the opponent's round, the line infantry shoots the Impy, who's now down to, say, 50% health, while the line infantry takes no damage in retaliation because they're a ranged unit and remains at 75% health. So you can see how this becomes a problem for the Impy. And not only that, but they're severely inhibited by the fact that they're melee units in their ability to actually choose what targets they want to hit. So yes, it is a lower production cost, but they're not nearly as combat effective as just having a whole bunch of line units or having a whole bunch of siege artillery or whatever. True, they do not require any resources, but neither do line infantry, actually. So they really don't have an advantage there. I believe they are slightly less population to recruit, and again, they are lower production cost, but there really isn't a strong use case for the Impy. Now, where did I put the Zulu overall? I do think you can argue they're D, but I think the +2 combat strength specifically, as well as the health regeneration, does put the Zulu a bit above the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians in this respect. It does give them a little bit of flexibility on attack, particularly regenerating units after a siege, and if you're able to get to a city in one turn from your own territory. And the militarist affinity is better than the aesthete and expansionist affinity here, because it allows you to raise reserves that are ranged units, right? And that can actually be a kind of viable strategy in some ways, is if you use iron reserves to recruit this large army of the garrison unit, which is now a ranged unit in the industrial era. So it's kind of like serving a very cheap replacement to line infantry that has a lower population cost, because you only have to sacrifice one unit to convert to one population to convert into one unit. And you don't have to produce anything, so it saves you production, while simultaneously being not that much lower of combat strength and still having the same sort of ranged effectiveness. So I do think that, typically you're not going to pick the Zulu, but they do offer you more benefits than the Austro-Hungarians or the Russians currently do. So I couldn't quite justify putting it down in the same tier as them. So I would say they're in the C tier, but they're probably the lowest of the available C tier picks. So that wraps up the tier list for the industrial era. Thanks for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And let me know what you think about these ratings. If you've watched my videos up to this point, I love talking about this kind of stuff in the comments and, considering the impact of different changes on the game and what I might have overlooked in the different cultures and all that kind of stuff. So leave a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts. And like I said at the beginning of the video, I think I'm going to do something a little bit different for the contemporary era because of how busted contemporary era is. The industrial era approaches that level of being busted, but isn't quite there. It's really just the French that are the real significant problem here. So thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.